hand over to Don to kickstart us off on the topic of have vegans got it right?
Thank you, Andreas. Well, for millions of years, humans have eaten meat, originally by hunting, and in the last 12,000 years by farming animals. We have feelings of moral duties to each other and to an extent to other animals. And it's a valid question for us to ask whether we have really got that right. We can be reasonably certain that all the characteristics of ourselves and other animals, to the extent that they're not random, have been formed by the relatively simple process of natural selection. Any characteristic which made survival and reproduction more likely would be selected. And that's all there is to it, nothing more. Many people hope for a more exalted purpose, but can never quite identify it. And I think the reason is it's not there. Humans exist today with domesticated species, which provide us with meat and other foods, power, companionship, and other good things. In this long association, humans and animals have co-evolved, and the domesticated species have adapted to our needs and have spread over the world, becoming much more numerous than their wild relatives. All animals under natural selection evolve characteristics that make them better adapted to their environment, and domesticated animals do this too. The difference is that their environment is not the natural one, but an artificial one created by humans. Yet the principle remains the same. They survive and reproduce better when they become better providers of the things that humans want. For many of these species, it has been a very successful niche. Some thousands of years ago, humans stopped hunting and chose instead to domesticate the red jungle fowl of Southeast Asia. The bird has continued to evolve and has adapted to its new role. It has less fear of its keepers than its wild ancestors, and it produces eggs without fertilization of a male. Its breast muscles are larger than a flightless bird needs, but these supply good meat. The strategy has been immensely successful. From an obscure localized species, it has vastly increased its population all over the world. There are now more domesticated chickens than human beings in the world. It's a similar story with cattle. In the plant world too, many have reproduced more successfully through their symbiosis with humans. A mediocre grass from the Middle East is now cultivated all over the world and has adapted by providing many more seeds of greater nutritional value. But in what sense can we say that domesticated animals benefit from their position? Certainly, if the object is to survive and reproduce, they do it better than their wild cousins. A pair of red jungle fowl in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia can raise perhaps 100 chicks in a lifetime, but the population does not increase 100-fold every few years. In fact, it remains roughly the same, which means that the majority of chicks fail to reproduce, either starving in the struggle to find food, or perhaps themselves becoming food for a predator. Our chickens, in contrast, are well-fed, protected from predators, and enjoy a longer life than the average of their wild cousins. Their deaths are painless compared to dying of starvation or in the teeth of a fox. Now, domesticated animals are not the only species that find a niche in providing food for other species. Grass has adapted to providing food for grazing animals, and it benefits by being better able to do this than its competing plants. Many plants grow fruit, which causes animals to distribute their seeds. Nectar is produced to tempt insects to distribute pollen. But can we say that the domesticated animals want to be our food providers? Certainly they have adapted their physical properties and behavior to serve us better. But as an example, think of plankton. There are several species that rise by night and descend by day, as if they are trying to avoid predators. But it's unlikely that they have any concept of predators. They're not trying to do anything. They have just been selected to make a diurnal rise and fall. Similarly, I don't suppose that our domesticated animals are trying to feed us better. They just happen to do that. And of course, humans are no more aware of their various aspirations were formed in historical conditions to give them the greatest number of grandchildren. We can conclude that domesticated animals have changed greatly to provide us with food or other useful things. They act in ways that serve that purpose, but are probably not aware why. Horses had a very successful niche in providing humans with power, but the invention of the steam engine and later the internal combustion engine were disasters for them. Populations crashed, and the only human ceremonial and leisure use has saved them from extinction. Wild populations of horses are tiny. But what adaptations have happened to humans? The domesticated plants and animals have greatly changed following the human adoption of agriculture, but have humans changed too? There is a well-known example of lactose intolerance. Originally in humans, the ability to digest milk declines after infancy, but in those parts of the world which have a history of dairy farming, this ability exists throughout life. Today, there are still peoples in parts of the world where there was no dairy farming who are unable to digest milk as adults. But farming may have changed us in other ways. Hunting and gathering requires different mental strategies from agriculture. Is it probable that we have mental adaptations? These are harder to identify, but the need to plan a year ahead, to desist from eating the seed kept for planting, and breeding to increase livestock were new ideas. Although hunters and gatherers needed significant skills, long-term thinking may have been less important. So much for the biological background. But what about the moral case? Some vegans and vegetarians have arrived at the conclusion that we have no right to use animals' bodies for our own food, and some extend this to the use of products taken from them, such as milk or wool. Some object vehemently to the use of animal skins as garments, but seem much more at ease with shoe leather. There are even fruitarians who feel that it is immoral to eat plants, except when they generate fruit which they intend for us to eat as a reward for spreading their seeds. Some go further and say only the fruit which has fallen from the plant is permissible. There's a clear need for philosophers who might be able to work out what is the correct moral position on these matters. But sadly, clear conclusions are lacking. After 1,000 years, moral philosophy has still little that we could practically use. The formulae which have been offered include the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or ideas based on a duty to follow some fair enough sounding maxims, or follow virtues that someone has proclaimed. All of these sound approximately reasonable, but when they are examined, it immediately becomes evidence that they do not define a clear decision rule, and it is often easy to think of exceptions. And even if these rules, thought up by well-meaning souls, could give a clear description, a clear prescription, where would their authority come from? They have been constructed by reference to gut feelings, the instincts that we have, but know not why. Once again, we see that philosophy underperforms when it doesn't take account of our evolutionary past. We observe that we have moral instincts and an instinct to cheat if we can get away with it. We also have an instinct to promote morality within our community and to suppress cheating. These instincts, like every non-random part of our bodies and brains, have come from our evolution as a social animal. Every instinct has arisen because those who had it survived and reproduced better than those who did not. It has often been said that morality could never arise between competing animals in the struggle for life. It has been said that nature is red in tooth and claw, but this is a naive idea. It takes only a moment's thought to realize that an early human in a tribal group would not reproduce better by acting in a totally immoral way. If people can cooperate, there's a payoff, and where there's a payoff, evolution will usually find a way to exploit it. Several mechanisms have been identified for the emergence of altruism. Kin altruism is an obvious one because children are the essence of reproduction, but other relatives also carry a proportion of the same genes. Reciprocal altruism can be observed between unrelated people. We do more for a friend that we trust than for a stranger. There are more complicated mechanisms by which morality could have evolved. Display altruism or reputation building is a characteristic of humans. Altruism is more often shown where there is no prospect of reciprocation, but we may cynically notice that people are more generous at a charity social event than when making donations in private. And with equal cynicism, we can note that we like to be seen as moral. We are happy to talk about our good deeds and less happy to talk about the times when we have cheated or been selfish. Although other species have evolved a degree of morality towards the group, humans, through the power of speech, have further complications. We have an instinct to conform to the morality of our community and to join in enforcing that morality. In a sense, punishment or even revenge is an altruistic act because it brings no benefit to the punisher, but enforces morality, bringing benefit to the larger group. But through speech and communication, humans are more different from other animals in having a changeable moral code. In other species, the moral behavior remains more or less constant, changing at the slow speed of genetic evolution. In humans, on the other hand, what is considered right can change drastically in less than a single lifetime. This can be useful in adapting to new circumstances, but it can also, through random drift, get us into fads and taboos. Societies distant from our own often seem to have bizarre customs, although we may seem to them to be equally bizarre. This change of human moral principles is related to the means of communication. For millennia, change was slow, but an acceleration began with the invention of printing in the 15th century, and the rate of change has increased with newspapers, radio, and now the internet. We now are more frequently exposed to exhortations about moral ideas than our ancestors were. So what are we to make of the exhortations that we receive from vegetarians, vegans, fruitarians, and the like? They urge us to forsake the benefits of the omnivorous diet and useful products that we have enjoyed during the last 12,000 years of agriculture and millions of years of hunting and gathering before that. We can analyze the basis for altruism towards animals. Peter Singer, the alleged philosopher and author of Animal Liberation, has said that because animals can suffer, it proves that we have a duty towards them. But this is very poor philosophy, because it flies in the face of the principle that you cannot deduce a value from a statement of fact alone. There's the old example that if we see a man drowning, we ought to throw him a lifebelt. But this reasoning would not work if we were indifferent to whether he drowns or not. In fact, yes, we ought to throw him a lifebelt, but only because we all accept the unstated premise that we ought to help those whose lives are in danger. Singer's deduction works only if we assume an unstated premise that we have a duty to animals that can suffer, which is what he's purporting to prove. But perhaps suffering is not even relevant, because domesticated species suffer less than their wild counterparts, and with correct animal husbandry, they should not suffer at all. Let us try a better analysis of the ethical position. Clearly, kin altruism cannot apply, although the reciprocal altruism certainly can. If we treat our domesticated animals well, they will be likely to cooperate with us better. But a large part of our morality towards animals has developed through display altruism or reputation building. Humans who are seen by other humans being gratuitously cruel to animals would not be seen as trustworthy. Morality or altruistic behavior arose in all animals, including ourselves, as something which increased the probability of surviving and reproducing. In humans alone, we have the cultural modification of our moral sentiments. We can seek more appropriate moral principles, although the criteria for greater appropriateness, where that might come from, is a philosophical question for another occasion. But what is the best interest for a cow? As far as I know, it's to be free from predators, to have plenty of grass to eat, to have the company of its herd, to avoid pain, and to have its overdeveloped udder emptied regularly, and to get along affably with the human farmer. Although the cow may not be conscious of it, these instincts have been evolved because they helped the cow's ancestors to survive and reproduce. It probably doesn't attach importance to a long life because it doesn't contemplate its own mortality as humans do. The cow behaves as if survival and reproduction is its purpose, although, as we have discussed, it is not the purpose of any mind, not even the cow's, but is simply a function of its selective history in an agricultural environment. But suppose we have a philosopher cow, which has achieved a much deeper understanding of things than her fellows. What would she consider her interest to be? If all human beings take the vegan's advice, there will be no more cows. Extinction is very probable. It's implausible to think that a wild population could exist or imagine that cows could survive as the remnant horses have done by satisfying human ceremonial or leisure needs. I think the philosopher cow would say to the vegan, "Thank you very much indeed. You mean very well, but no thanks. We have our niche which has allowed us to spread worldwide. It's not perfect, but it's better than that experienced by our wild ancestors, and it's certainly a lot better than you are offering." Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Don. That's a very interesting and evolutionary discussion around veganism and the evolutionary path, including some morality thrown in. So excellent. Thank you very much for that. I think that's a very strong basis from which we can now proceed. Now, Don,
and now I invite you, Andreas, to shoot me down in flames.
I wouldn't shoot you down in flames at all. I think what is quite interesting, though, is that we know each other so well that we probably know what we're going to be talking about without even colluding. So it's going to be quite an interesting discussion afterwards. So my style is slightly different. Don likes the traditional talks of transcripts and talking about a lecture. I use slides in my form to communicate my messages. So I hope you don't mind if I share the presentation with you, and we can get started. Right, I hope you can all see that. Okay, so the question before us, which Don has already addressed, is have vegans got it right? Now, for me, that is a very binary question for a hugely complex issue. And I want to share with you some of the sort of dimensions that I will explore. Obviously, given a 20-minute time frame, I'm not going to be able to cover everything in detail here, but hopefully it will be of interest. First of all, we need to define what veganism is before we can have the discussion. The next question is, in what way is this a question about being right or wrong? Yeah, is this really a binary discussion around right or wrong, or is this about a way of living? What are the considerations to be taken into account? I think is the other very important question. I will cover briefly in terms of why are people making veganism part of the way they live? How do ethics inform veganism? How do ecological considerations impact their lifestyle? Which dietary choices are important? What are the social, economic, and political drivers of these impacts? What has philosophy got to offer? And then finally, how is the prevailing zeitgeist, worldview, spirit of the age changing? So I've only got 20 minutes, so we need to rattle on through. In terms of common carnivore justifications and criteria, where people cite that meat is an acceptable diet, you would quote, find certain things like this. the biological inheritance of natural selection. So we wouldn't have we wouldn't have the jaw, we wouldn't have the canines, we wouldn't have the digestive system if we weren't meant to be meat eaters. The response to that would be, and I'm not going to cover this in detail because I hope that will come out in the Q&A session, does biological capacity confer moral justification? I am biologically involved as a person to do lots of things, lots of violent things, lots of peaceful things. Doesn't mean I should do them. So I think that would be one question for later on. The second one is the nutritional argument. It gives us the necessary proteins and amino acids for our diet in terms of the way we have evolved. The counter argument would be alternatives exist in nuts, seeds, beans, cereals, pulses, and so on. The next one is we are top of the food chain, and therefore evolution is about survival of the fittest, or might makes right. Now, the response to this kind of evolutionary argument would be, well, does strength and fitness confer moral justification? And you know, again, I have a certain physical appearance. I weigh 14 stone. I'm 6'2". Therefore, I'm stronger than some other humans, never mind animals. Therefore, am I right to eat meat purely on my evolutionary path? Would be the response. And the Anthropocene, the speciesism, that where we are afforded a special status as Homo sapiens. The evolutionary path is a hierarchy that develops over time, but humanity is slightly different. We would not eat each other, our own kind, you know, but because we are part of the food chain, it is perfectly acceptable for us to eat other species. So does nature really differentiate? And why does the hierarchy not extend to humans? You know, so why are all humans treated as team human rather than actually being separated out between the weak and the strong? Or is this argument really just a veiled survival of the fittest criterion? And the final one is the way of nature. It is what it is. You know, the evolution has given us a natural way, a natural order of things that demonstrates some moral value. And here we have the naturalistic fallacy that G.E. Moore commented on, and actually what sets the human species apart, that we have autonomy to do otherwise. We are not determined by impulses and reflexes to actually just behave in certain ways. So this draws on our anxiety of freedom, rights and responsibilities, and our abdication of accountability for the food chain in which we take part. So these are the sort of arguments and counter-arguments. The definitions of veganism, I've looked at a couple of dictionaries, the Cambridge English Dictionary. The practice of not eating or using any animal products such as meat, fish, eggs, cheese, or leather. And then strict veganism prohibits the use of all animal products, not just food, and is a lifestyle choice rather than a diet. The Collins Dictionary is slightly less helpful. Someone who is vegan never eats meat or animal products such as milk, butter, or cheese. So that's much more just dietary rather than also byproducts. Now, to get a fuller definition, I went to the Vegan Society, and the Vegan Society is interesting because it actually positions veganism not just as a dietary choice, but as a way of life, and actually positions itself as having its own philosophy. So vegan here, I'm just going to read that to you. Veganism is a philosophy and a way of life which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practical, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. In dietary terms, it denotes the practice of dispensing with all products derived wholly or partly from animals. Okay, so I'm going to highlight just very briefly 3 types of vegans. There is the vegan who is becoming a vegan for dietary and nutritional reasons. It's because they perceive a healthy plant-based diet to be better and healthier in terms of the proteins and the fatty acids and the minerals it provides. They are vegans for dietary and nutritional reasons because of concerns with health impacts of meat products, use of steroids, microplastics in the oceans, pollution. They believe that the healthier lifestyle in terms of cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, diabetes and cancer. And the British Dietetic Association and the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recognize that a vegan diet is suitable for every age and stage of life. And there's some research, this is with the Vegan Society, that linked vegan diets to lower blood pressure, cholesterol, lower rates of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and some types of cancer. Whether that is actually a defined differential to a healthy omnivore diet is questionable. But I think the vegans, if they have a full vegetarian diet, is a healthy diet that doesn't exclude omnivores also having a healthy diet with a meat mix in the diet. Ecologically, I think the picture becomes slightly more significant. So these are vegans who are actually becoming vegan, not just for themselves, but actually to help the planet. And I'm going to share with you some statistics which might be helpful. In Brazil alone, the equivalent of 5.6 million acres of land is used to grow soya beans for animals in Europe. Global deforestation, every year woodland is deforested to the equivalent to the size of Costa Rica. Land degradation and the acidification of the oceans and continued CO2 emissions will contribute to global warming, widespread decline in arable lands, pollution, water scarcity, and species extinction. The world will only have 60% of the water it needs by 2030 without significant global policy change, according to a recent report from the UN, and that's the Agricultural Organization, Food and Agricultural Organization. In terms of the efficiency of production, it takes 15,500 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of beef, in contrast with 180 liters for 1 kilogram of tomatoes and 250 liters of 1 kilogram of potatoes. So the efficiency of production of cereals, grains, vegetables, etc., is one of the key reasons why ecological vegans become vegan in the first place. Globally, farming uses about 70% of the planet's accessible fresh water. And this is farming itself. This is compared to around 20% of industry and 10% for domestic use. And 26% of the planet's terrestrial surface is devoted to livestock grazing, which consumes million tons of cereals, 1/3 of the global cereal harvest. So it's intensive. So the argument here is that livestock rearing, grazing, and production is very, very labor intensive, very resource intensive, and actually has a significant negative impact on the climate. And this is some estimation in terms of how a plant-based diet could change things. It would reduce agricultural land use by 76%, 3.1 billion hectares, an area the size of Africa, and cut total global greenhouse gas emissions by 28%. And then finally, which is something that John already mentioned, but I think this is quite important. Livestock make up 60% of the biomass of all mammals on Earth, followed by humans, 36%, and wild mammals, 4%. It just shows you the extent to which livestock has now been domesticated and reared. And 70% of all birds are domesticated, such as poultry birds. Only 30% are in the wild. Now, I think, again, Don positioned this as a successful reproduction. And I think the next set of vegans are taking that to task. And that is really about the welfare of the animals that are in what they describe as the mechanized food industry. So here we go. 60 billion land animals and more than 1 trillion marine animals are killed each year for human consumption. Compassion for and kindness to non-human animals and sentient life is another reason why people believe to become vegan and vegetarian. that actually kindness and compassion should be extended beyond the human species, is basically the argument. The mechanized food industry in particular has alienated us as individual consumers from the ecosystem and the biosphere in which we live. So, and this is really important because this relates to an accountability. When we buy our meat, our chicken, our lamb, our beef, our fish, we have no concept of the value chain, where that has come from and under which condition it has been reared, it's been treated, transported, and ultimately slaughtered. And I think that's one of the key reasons why vegans are becoming a plant-based diet. And this is, you know, life itself has become a commodity. The value of a chicken is, or value of beef is no longer, the value of life has no value in itself. The only value it has is in the money it brings. The money you get in the market for actually selling the animal. And otherwise there's no value in a non-human life. The other thing to mention is the lifespans. I mean, Don mentioned that actually, you know, it's successful because they're free of predators. I think cows in captivity have a lifespan of 3 to 7 years before they're slaughtered, against a sort of natural lifespan of about 20 years in the wild. Cows still exist. I'm glad to inform you also in India, where they are a holy animal, so they haven't quite gone extinct in the wild. Now, chickens, I've got a similar issue. Broiler chickens are 6 weeks old before they're killed for meat, and they're pumped full of steroids and other things to actually increase their weight that they can't actually physically support from a cardiovascular point of view, and they live for 6 weeks rather than a potential lifespan of 10 years. Now, battery hens have been banned in this country based on space previously of 430 square centimeters. That was the battery hen. That's 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters, or 15 inches by 15 inches. No, less than that, 10 inches by 10 inches, even less than that. Now, enriched caged hens are now permissible. They live on a patch of 600 square centimeters, which is 30 centimeters by 20 centimeters, and no bigger than a sheet of A4. And this is the kind of issue that vegans object to in terms of the way that animals are reared, kept, transported, and killed. And again, we talk about animal welfare in terms of malnutrition, torture, etc. So I think these are some of the kind of examples that vegan would cite as an issue. They also feel that vegans believe in the no harm and non-violence principle, which I'll come on to in just a second. 98% of all animal products are from intensive non-organic farming. Only 2% are organic. Free-range chickens doesn't mean they're roaming the countryside, as Don may have us believe. I'm not sure he does, but free-range chickens still allows 9 chickens to 1 square meter, and they may not always be outside. So I think we need to really be clear about this. And 100 million non-human animals are used in research and testing every year. So that gives you the ethical dimension. I don't know whether you've seen the film Cowspiracy, but it's a good documentary to have a go at if you're interested. And it comes up with some estimation of what can be saved by an average vegan with a US diet. Could save 1.5 million liters of water, 6,600 kilograms of grain, 1,022 square meters of forest cover, 3,322 kilograms of CO2, and 365 animal lives compared to the average US diet. In terms of philosophical considerations, I'm going to sort of rattle through this because I don't really want to take up too much time before we get into the crux of it, but here it goes. This is an issue for ontology and ethics, which Don has already highlighted. The concept of ahimsa, which is non-violence, is well known and practiced in both Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain thought. Jain thought is much more extreme, where it is actually people covering their faces not to inhale insects and things like that. But I think the idea of non-violence and actually leading a good life and not being associated with anything that produces violence, either to the human or non-human animal, is a key tenet of those philosophies. Virtue is the ethics in terms of ancient Greeks. We have the flourishing life, eudaimonia, with Aristotle. The excellence of character, being a virtuous person with compassion, kindness, qualities that actually enrich life, not just for the individual, but the society they live in. And Socrates and the examined life. And actually taking accountability for our lives and asking ourselves existential questions in terms of how we lead our lives, and actually researching into that life where our food comes from, for example, how other species are treated that actually become our food potentially. And these are all ancient moral considerations. Descartes, René Descartes, 17th century French philosopher, had a completely different view. He actually regarded animals as a machine, an automata, without feelings and pain, and actually pinned live animals to his door to actually dissect them. And that was not an unusual thought. You know, it was really quite recent that actually humanity discovered that animals feel pain, you know, have anguish, have anxieties, even mourn like elephants. We talk about utilitarianism and consequentialism. So Don already mentioned the minimization of pain principle. This is utilitarianism, and the founder of that, Jeremy Bentham. He was asked about animals, and he replied, and this is a quote, "The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" Deontology, which is, so utilitarian focuses only on the consequences of one's actions. Are one's actions justified by the consequences they bring? The other moral position in philosophy is deontology, and one of the key proponents there is Immanuel Kant, and he has come up with 3 categorical imperatives or interpretations. There is the maxim, act only according to that maxim, by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. The second orientation of that is act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And ethical vegans would extend that to non-human animals. And every rational being must so act as if he were, through his maxim, always a legislating member in a universal kingdom of ends. And that's the autonomy definition of the categorical imperative. Kant mentions sapere aude, dare to be wise. What he's encouraging us to do is to find out about the reality of the life that we lead and the impact we have in the society in which we operate, which includes non-human life. Okay. Let's go on. I think I had to let somebody in, which means that this might, yeah. Okay, Don already mentioned Peter Singer. In suffering, animals are equal, which is basically Jeremy Bentham's point as well. Vegans would also look at the philosophical side in terms of societal progress, that we're moving from a worse understanding to a better understanding, not just about humanity and human society, but also of the living world around us. And therefore, even in evolutionary theory, it is perfectly natural for us to think differently about the environment and others with whom or which we share the environment, that might well change as we progress into a better understanding of the world. And Charles Darwin, obviously, who published on species, of evolution, there's no fundamental difference between man and animals in their ability to feel pleasure and pain, happiness and misery. Okay, so this comes straight from the big man himself. Okay. And then a final quote from Plato: the gods created certain kinds of beings to replenish our bodies. They are the trees and the plants and the seeds. So just to give you some sort of philosophical context here, both ancient and current. Now the final thing is, I like this quote, George Bernard Shaw: animals are my friends and I don't eat my friends. Okay, final thing before we go. The final slide is all about a new zeitgeist. The times, they are changing, a Bob Dylan quote. And here I want to just focus on a couple of things. We should really explore claims, and the current generation and the forthcoming generations are much better informed in terms of fake news, post-truth scenarios, and are much more able, because of technology and the internet, but also much more engaged in actually finding out about the truth of certain claims in terms of the food industry, in terms of the mechanized food industry, in terms of the treatment of each other, both humans and non-humans. Yeah, and I think there's much more, the current generation has more access to information, knowledge, and understanding around some of the key issues around veganism and vegetarianism than previous generations. It is freely available. They also have a much more global environmental focus in terms of climate change. Climate change is something that the previous generation really has heard very little about, and despite various protocols from Kyoto back in 1990, it really only raised its head in the early 2000s as an existential threat. Ethically sourced food and products are much more important, whether, you know, so the current generation, upcoming generation, want to understand the value chain from which their food or products have come from, including fast fashion, etc. They actually derive value from things being done ethically. And they also, I believe, they're accountable for the choices they make. So as far as they're concerned, they cannot just buy something and not feel accountable for how the product has got onto the shelves. And therefore, they want to understand how the animal was reared, the condition it was kept in, the way it was treated, the way it was killed, etc., in order for them to actually make their own dietary choices. And the generation also believe that actually this is no longer about consumption and ownership, and the younger generation are moving to use and access, and, you know, in everything that they do. So, for example, no longer music is not something that you own; it's just something that you have access to through streaming services, etc. For example. Oops, it's stuck again. Let me just go one step further. Okay, and the new generation focus on dynamic and complex ecology and the biosphere of the planet, but also the way that they source their products. And finally, the importance of relationality, of how you relate to others in society, and also how you relate to other species, is very important to that generation and drives a different potential for change. And that really is it. That's the kind of things that I wanted to cover. So I hope that's given you an insight from a vegan perspective, and we now get to the place where we can have a good discussion around whether vegans have got it right. Now, the only thing that would be helpful is for as many of you as can to actually unmute and show your screen, because it's a much easier way of having a decent discussion. And when you ask your question, it would be really helpful if you could indicate up front whether it's directed towards Don or myself, because then that makes my life much easier. Duncan, you're the first one.
Yeah, I put my question on chat.
Right.
But okay. I don't know how to send it. Have you found it?
No, I haven't got it yet. Maybe you have to ask it in person, Duncan.
No?
Well, what it says on the chat there is direct message.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't seem to have anything in the chat room just yet.
Let me read it to you anyway, then, okay? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Don.
Andreas, could I just come in there? I wanted to come in after your talk to say really excellent, and in some ways I regret that we didn't collude in advance, because I think we could have reflected off our various arguments a little better.
Yeah.
But I find that I actually agree with a great deal of what you said. Certainly the diet and the ecological considerations are worthwhile. And the Jain principle of non-violence, for example, I think someone said that terrorism due to fundamentalism depends on what the fundamentals are, and Jain fundamentalism would be just fine. But there are various other points. The research into medicines, for example.
Yeah.
Do vegans actually decline medical products which have been checked out by animal research? I don't know.
Yeah.
But
the quick answer
there's much that could be commented on. I think one of the fundamentals that's difficult to get to is what is the value of the length of life.
Yeah.
Sorry, when I said Dom, I meant what
Yes.
you meant.
No,
my question is directed to Dom.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it possible for me to ask a question now, Dom?
Go ahead.
Yes, just say it.
I'm reading it, yeah. You have said that philosophy underperforms, yet with respect, and with a great deal of respect, especially on Burns Night, you have not performed any philosophy, just giving a set of beliefs. For example, an instinct conformed to a moral norm, right? That does not give any support to what those moral norms would be. You have also stated your belief that you cannot deduce value from a statement of fact. Yet you have stated, sorry, is it me?
There are noises coming from somewhere.
Yes.
If you're not asking a question at this point, could you mute yourself so that...
Yeah, I'm finding it difficult to ask my question because someone's making a noise. Unless it's a fault with me. It could be a fault with me, I don't know. But anyway, you've stated as a post fact that we have an instinct to conform to moral norms. The utilitarian view has to be refuted on philosophical grounds. For example, that the greatest happiness of the greater number is meaningless. Imagine the greatest number of repairs to the greatest number of bikes. The result is negligible. Virtue ethics tells us that to be great-hearted, we must minimize animal pain because we are cognizant of it.
Yeah. Okay.
So are you doing philosophy at all? Or are you simply giving up before you've started, Dom?
I think you do put your finger on a fundamental point, which is quite important. Most philosophy is done by people dragging ideas out of their gut feelings. And their gut feelings have arisen as a product of our evolution as social animals. However, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily right. It's a matter of fact. We have this principle that you cannot deduce a value from a statement which only concerns facts. And the thinking about the evolutionary origin of our moral instincts, these are facts. In a philosophical sense, they don't tell us what they ought to be. But that's a big subject and one, I think, for a different evening.
Okay.
Thanks very much. My question is on the chat somewhere. So if people, I apologize for it being long and complicated, but it is there somewhere.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan. Anybody else? Chrissy, do you want to unmute yourself and you can ask a question?
Hang on. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I lived for 20 years self-sufficiently, right, in amongst my lovely animals who we loved. And I remember taking our sheep. I actually didn't eat one of the sheep because she was my pet, and I brought her up and bottle fed her. But I ate her brother, and I said, "Is it all right if I eat your brother?" And she said, "Have you got an apple?" I said, "No," and she went off in disgust. And we took him in the car to the local butcher. He was very excited. He had a lovely time. And the butcher said hello, and the sheep said hello. And the butcher put a stone gun to his head And he went, and I would quite like to go that way. It was really quite a nice way to die. So what I'm trying to say is for 20 years, we had geese and ducks and chickens and everything, okay? But since I've lived in Bath, I'm finding it difficult to eat animals. And I'm worried that because we've become city dwellers, we've become oversensitive, you see? That we're making these philosophical points for why we shouldn't eat animals, but my animals were hyper happy. And I'm very worried there'd be no more happy animals in the world.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah,
Is that a point?
That's a good. Who are you directing this observation to me or to Don?
Well, Don was really on my side over that in a way, yes? But I'm directing it to you because I think you're very much a city person.
No, and I grew up in the countryside, and I classify myself as a country bumpkin. The furthest I've moved towards Bath is in Bathampton, and I'm next to Bathampton Woods. So I certainly don't classify myself as a city dweller. I grew up in a little village in Bavaria overlooking the Alps. So we can't get more organic than that. And to some extent, that is exactly, I suppose, excuse the pun, my beef with the mechanized food industry.
Oh yes, I don't like that.
Because
I do want to make one point here that's terribly, terribly important to me. It's how we kill them that matters. It's not whether we eat them or not. It's how we kill them. Putting them in lorries and making them go in queues and frightening them. I'm totally anti that. When I lived in the country, I was anti that. So I just want that point put.
So I think the comment I would make is if you have a symbiotic relationship with your animal and there is benefit by the animal being domesticated, and you derive benefit from the animal, whether it's wool, milk, etc. I think that's a slightly different argument than obviously the mechanized food industry. So I think if we agree that 98% of the world's meat production, fish production is mechanized with absolutely zero value ascribed to the animal at all, then we can park the 2% in terms of organic farming, etc., and say, well, actually, it is about the relationship with the animal. It is also, but that still leaves the question of whether it is right to kill the animal. And the question then goes, is that something that is normative? Is that something that's historic and culturally driven? I.e., in 2,000 years ago, we didn't have any other means of transportation for animals. We needed to eat animals to get our proteins, our amino acids, our diet, etc. Given that that is no longer necessary in the 21st century for large parts of society, particularly the Western society, who are responsible in large part for the mechanized food industry, is that really required? Would be my response to you. But
I agree with you. I think probably in the modern world we are going your way, and it probably won't stop. But I am a little bit worried that it's being caused by our city dwelling.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, if you go into a shop and the 4-year-old child points and says, "Oh, look, Mum, it's a cow," right? And the only definition of a cow is a piece of meat on the counter rather than a living animal. I think you're getting to what I would call an alienation from nature and the environment in which you inhabit. You become very sterilized. Anyway, thank you for your question, Chrissy. Anybody else? Valerie, you've raised your hand. You just need to unmute. And please let me know whether it's a question for Don or for me.
Okay.
Yes, I have. What do you think about the new development of growing meat in a laboratory? So it appears to be as good, having all the nutritional values of normal, actually meat without any animals.
Yeah, is that to me or is it to Don? Is that a question for me or is it for Don?
Who's question for, Mum?
Right, me?
No, who are you asking the question to answer?
To yourself.
Oh, to me. Okay. So I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I remember the first burger produced, I think, in Holland was the first burger that was produced, and it was 100,000 pounds of lab-grown meat. And obviously, as time goes on, I think it's going to be a potential inevitability going forward, that actually these will be a way we source some of our food in the future. I am not one of my thoughts aren't around at what generational level does meat grown in the petri dish become non-meat. I think the idea that actually we are potentially preventing future anguish and suffering of animals by actually producing meat-based foods is something that some vegans would find acceptable. However, other vegans would say, actually, there is already alternatives out there, whether that is soya, tofu, corn, quinoa, etc. Lots of alternatives, foodstuffs that actually taste much better than reconstituted lab meat, which is sort of 10 generations old. So I think the jury is open, but I think you would be very hard pressed as a vegan saying that you would have the same issue with 10th generation lab meat than you would have with the mechanized food industry, the crushing of male chicks in a macerator in battery hen operations and things like that. So I think there would be much less uproar about 10th generation petri dish meats. I think it's one of the inevitability going forward. We're probably going to see some of that as time progresses. Thank you. Anybody else? Julia Garrett.
It's a small concern, but the argument always seems to be that vegans have the ecology totally on their side. And yet I've heard that the grassland is one of the best carbon sinks. And there's a danger of turning dairy farming land to crop growing, which would actually remove a carbon sink. So I think we have to take into account all sorts of arguments. It isn't all one way. And after all, a lot of deforestation is for palm oil, and palm oil goes into non-meat products. Yeah. So sometimes it seems as though all righteousness is on the side of vegans, and I just wanted to make that one point.
No, well, I think that's a really good point. Is that to me, Julia, or is it to Don?
I think probably more to you.
Yeah, I thought it might be me. No, so I agree with you, and I think it is really, really important that it is equally as important for a vegan to understand the provenance and the value chain of where their products are sourced from and come from. So, for example, if soya is one of your, as a vegan, is your main diet, and it gets transported from halfway around the world, and it's the result of deforestation in the rainforests of Brazil, not grown, the soya isn't grown for animal fodder, but it's actually for human consumptions, or palm oil, as you highlight, then you are not contributing to saving the planet. You're doing exactly the opposite. So I totally agree with you. It's not a one-way street. The vegan has as much emphasis on securing knowledge of the value chain of the food that they consume as the meat eater does. I think the only point I would make is that vegans tend to be more tuned into this. In general, they have more a sense of accountability and a need to know where this is coming from. And obviously, we are in veganery, and there will be a big drop off after January, which is veganery, for people to return to their normal diets. They will have tried something and probably got sponsored, sponsorship money to do it. But I think it doesn't help necessarily for people to take a look and make sure that they actually understand where their food comes from. And I think that's the big point to make. And I should have mentioned it. I didn't mention it, but as we were talking about the pandemic, the idea is that it started in a wet food market, and allow the transition from one species to the other would be another vegan argument I didn't make, and I probably would need to look into a great deal more whether that holds any water whatsoever. Anyway, who wants to ask the next question? No. Wow,
I'll come back if you like. No, it's Trevor.
Oh, Trevor. Trevor is waving. Trevor, over to you.
I'm waving.
The question of.
To you, Andreas. It seems to me that the difficulty here is giving the people who don't want to eat meat a name. Vegan, vegetarianism, etc.
Yeah.
Surely it's a question of choice, isn't it? Because now we're putting all this forward that they've got much more sensibility towards the planet, etc. Surely there are lots of more things to worry about in this world than this whole discussion about whether we're treating animals cruelly or not. There's lots of more things that are contributing to the destruction of the planet. But this word vegan now is thrown around as if it's some sort of religion almost that people. And I've heard people say we're going to change everybody. We're going to make it a law that you can't eat meat, etc. Surely it's a choice, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose it is a choice, and with that right of choice comes the responsibility, and that responsibility is that you identify yourself with a certain lifestyle. Now, the issue, I suppose, is that in today's society, nobody will be held accountable for the mechanized food industry, least of all the consumers like you and I. Yeah, we are not going to be affected by this at all. But by being aware of the mechanized food industry, by making that choice of eating meat, you are therefore also need to be responsible. You need to hold yourself accountable for that value chain.
No, I don't.
Well, I think this is where we probably part company, Trevor, because I think, you are the end consumer, and this is how, as you know, you used to run a business school, this is how business works, dictates the future demand of that product. And therefore, de facto, you're contributing to the continuation of a way of operating. And, you could argue back and say, look, if I'm just getting a small holding food from organic farms where I know the provenance and I know the animals, how they've been kept, etc., then I eat meat and that's my choice. That's a different scenario. But I think, the message, I suppose, for me is, in the modern world, let's not get too divorced and alienated from the life around us. And we should be cognizant of how we consume things, whether it's food, products, whatever, to actually understand whether we support the way in which that has taken place. That's all I would say. But you're absolutely right, Trevor. It is ultimately a choice of the individual. But in existential terms, your freedom of making the choices also comes with responsibilities. Okay.
Can I come in, Andreas?
Yes, of course.
Yes, I think I wouldn't call veganism exactly a religion, but it should, of course, be an individual choice. Certainly, no one should enforce their style and lifestyle on anyone else any more than they should in a real religion, where it should be individual choice. But I think there are some disadvantages in the fact that we didn't collude in our presentations, because we really needed to answer each other's points. Yeah. And of course that's been absent. But there's one fundamental thing which I think I'm not sure any of us have the answer to, and that is, what is the value of animal life? Yeah. What is the value of a long life, for example? If we assume that an ethical meat eater is going to treat animals humanely and slaughter them humanely at the end of their lives, is a lot of animal lives that are shorter better than fewer which are longer? Yeah. If the domesticated species actually has a happier and more suffering-free life than the wild animal, what is the value of that? If stopping meat eating results in a very much smaller number of animal lives, yeah. What value can we place on that? I think these are difficult questions with no obvious.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I think the value of life is interesting, isn't it? I mean, my sons even ask me, what's better, to live long or to sort of shine twice as bright for a shorter period of time? You know, the typical sort of James Dean type of approach, you know, burn the candle at both ends. That's a better life rather than a long life. And that relates to humans as much as it does to animals. I suppose the lifespan of an animal should be also linked to the quality of its life. And you know, I think where we parted company, Don, is that you believe that actually domesticated animals live longer than their wild counterparts. The statistics seem to suggest the opposite, but
there can be no doubt about that, because the great majority of wild animals don't make it to adulthood and don't reproduce, simply because if they did, the Malthusian situation would have us completely drowned in each species of animal.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously there's a balance in terms of predators and predated, and I think that's absolutely right. But you know, it's difficult to see that, you know, if a cow's lifespan in captivity is 3 to 7 years before it's slaughtered, calves even earlier in terms of veal, chickens 6 weeks, and they're pumped full of steroids in battery hen situations, then that's a different way than you would describe free range and looking after your animals. And you know,
but if we move to the situation where there are no cows, or maybe a small remnant population, is this in the cow's interest? I don't know.
Well, yeah, but this is quite interesting, because I think we probably haven't got time for this today. But I mean, the idea of projecting the future cow population, and in terms of what they would think, as you quite rightly point out, the cow itself doesn't probably think much about its future existence and its numbers, but it does feel pain, and it does suffer in this life, rather than projecting its feelings of what it would be like if there were less numbers in the future. The same argument would go.
I certainly agree it feels pain, but the question is if stock management can be managed in a manner which prevents suffering and which deals with welfare correctly, then that rather takes that argument away.
So it takes the argument away if animals are treated well.
Yes, if they're treated well and welfare is properly attended to, we still have to say, do we put a value on the length of the life? Bearing in mind that the length of the life is shorter in the wild state.
Yeah, well, this is I think where we probably sort of slightly disagree, because you know it would be difficult to see a 6-week chicken, the average lifespan of a battery hen chicken is 6 weeks, whether that's shorter in the wild or not. I think you're right, though, that in terms of how many chicks would survive, you know, being born and then going into adulthood, probably in the wild they wouldn't. But equally, if you are a male chicken in the mechanized food industry, you survive 1 day, and then you're killed because you don't produce eggs. So I think there's lots of moral questions that need to be asked, and I think ultimately is how necessary in modern society in the 21st century is it that we actually eat meat? Or is it just something that, and this is where I suppose I'm becoming all Nietzschean now in you, and that is to say, how many of us are sheep, yes, like a herd, and just going along with the prevailing social norms? How many of us are lions who shout the big no, we're not going to carry on like this? And what percentage of us are the child who will look at things anew? Question mark. Anyway, Duncan, over to you. You want to ask another question?
Ever so briefly.
Yes, I know you.
No, but ever so briefly, right? We're not doing it. Sorry, is somebody interrupted? Sorry.
No, I think it must be you.
It could be my sound. Okay, no, but anyway, basically, we're not doing any philosophy. We're just chucking around beliefs. For example, there used to be a belief in medieval times that God exercises the kind of teleological purpose to the world, and that animals had their place in it.
Yeah.
Now, we believe in an impersonal Darwinian who has replaced the God of the medievals. And
Yeah.
in many ways, it's a much more vicious and much more cruel God. I don't believe that Darwinism can replace that ultimate sense of purpose. And let me just leave you with sorry? Let me just leave you with this example.
Yeah.
The fact that the cow is sacred in Hinduism is because they have a teleological view of the world, Hinduism, right, which goes beyond nature.
Yeah.
So in the end, I think perhaps we have lost something by replacing the Darwinian dimension, but by replacing the teleological God-related issue with the Darwinian one.
Absolutely. Okay, good comment. Do you want me to comment on it or Don?
I think I'd like you to comment, actually, because you've got more of the facts. You were more fact-based.
Okay, so I think the teleological edict of thou shalt and thou shalt not, I think is, in my own personal opinion, an easier way to navigate your life, because you don't have to take personal responsibility for your life. Your moral status is effectively given to you.
I mean, I can't accept that. I mean, the idea basically, if it says thou shalt not kill, that is an edict directly to your conscience. It means there's something you shouldn't do.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't leave you alone. It doesn't take the responsibility away.
No, well, you already, what I'm saying is it doesn't take your responsibility away in terms of not killing, but it actually prohibits you to actually make up your own mind around this. It already tells you what not to do. So you don't have to actually think for yourself to come up with your own moral status. And as you're quite right to say
it's the same in Darwinism. It's exactly the same in Darwinism. You know,
well, in Darwinism,
these deterministic forces do not give you a chance. They simply happen.
Yeah. Well, you see, when push comes to shove, in my view, actually, is quite simple. Is that as soon as you have to start to think about how animals are treated and whether we should eat them, if you actually have to rationalize it, you already lost the plot. This is something that you should be able to feel intuitively as part of a moral compass, whether it's teleological or Darwinian or otherwise. You should have.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I come in here on Duncan's question?
Because
Because
afterwards. Yeah, Don.
I think the sense of the question of purpose is.
Oh no, I think.
Don, your sound affected.
Quite an important one, but a Darwinian one does not dictate our purpose. We have evolved a sense of purpose, and in particular, the fact that we have, by and large, an instinct that we should.
You're breaking up.
Get Duncan to turn his sound off, because that might be what's interfering.
That comes from essentially building together. I don't hear any interference at the moment, but the point I'm making is that the feeling that we should not kill, which appears to be a purpose, comes from millions of years of having a treaty between each other not to kill each other. And of course, it made sense when people imagined gods for them to imagine that their God dictated this. But I don't think, well, some people believe that, I don't.
Okay. Chrissy.
Yes, I think I'm the only person here who has actually been a mummy to goslings and chicks and ducklings and lambs, okay?
Oh, no, you haven't.
Oh, I'm not the only person, am I?
I've been daddy to goats and pigs.
Oh, you've been a daddy, have you? Oh, good. Well, okay then. That's both of us. But I've lived with life and I've lived with death, and this is another philosophical question I'm saying to you. I am very worried that humans are losing touch with the beauty of death. I think we're getting so we want to live forever and we're frightened of dying. And I think death is beautiful. I died once and got sent back, but I was cross. I didn't want to come back, but I had to look after him.
Right.
That is very beautiful, and you know, to try. Humans seem to think you've got to stay alive forever and ever and ever. Yeah. And something philosophically profoundly upsetting about that to me. Now, you can all say I'm nuts.
No, we would never say that, Chrissy. And I think actually you're putting on something, you know, your finger on something that has got philosophical exploration in terms of. In fact, most of philosophers will probably argue that we're the only animal that have anxiety of death, right? Whereas the animal may have fear in a given situation of death, but not a long-term anxiety over dying, and therefore that's a different thing. And the human condition isn't going to improve if we treat death the way we have. I interviewed a gentleman who works in the Department of Death Psychology at Bath University earlier during the first lockdown, and he's affectionately known as Dr. Death. And you know, he's very clear that our Western attitude towards death is to push death away as far as possible and keep it to graveyards and morgues and hospitals, and not to be part of everyday life, family life. And I think that in itself is symptomatic of how we treat and how it's being perpetuated, how we actually see death. So I agree with you. It's and it's very noticeable in terms of mental health around the pandemic through which we live at the moment.
I think this is a very big subject, but possibly off our subject this evening, and something for another occasion.
Can you see this? It's Marduk 5. Yes. Marduk was the god in Babylon, in Esagalia, right? And I just happen to own one of the eyes, the other's in the Pierpoint Morgan Library. And it says on it in cuneiform, to Marduk, Lord of the universe, I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, give thee this for my welfare. So I've studied Marduk. And the beauty of Marduk, says, is that Marduk loves death because life loves death. So I'm just saying to you that my God here, Marduk, is a little bit worried that humans are getting frightened of death instead of honouring it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we need to distinguish between fear and anxiety. But yeah, absolutely. Point well made, Chrissy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Trevor, have you got another question?
What question? Anybody?
I thought Trevor was waving, but he's on mute still. So he's asking his question to his own computer.
I'm going to mute myself.
I'm sorry. I don't know if you or Don mentioned we don't eat human beings. Well, we do eat human beings. And I wonder how a vegan would react if they were part of the rugby team that was plane crashed in the Andes and they didn't have any berries or fruit or nuts to eat. Would a vegan then eat the human flesh? Andreas?
Well, to my mind I think, you know, I'm going to sound all Dom now. I'm going to sound all evolutionary now, but I think we have developed a sense of a survival instinct, and therefore, if that is the only thing on the planet that would sustain life, presumably a lot of people, I'm not sure it's just vegans, vegetarians, meat eaters, etc., would eat the dead corpses of their fellow travelers. Not too sure whether they would actually physically slaughter them to actually get at the food.
I think
that's a different thing. Don, you're breaking up again.
I think that's a very interesting case, the Andean plane crash. Can you hear me now?
No, I'm just going to mute.
I think it's a very interesting. We should note that it's not only human. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Anyhow, let me try again. I'm saying that I think it was completely morally justifiable for what the people on the Andean plane crash did. But we should also note the fact that not only humans, but most other species do not eat their own kind. There's a general moral principle that more than humans subscribe to.
Yeah, although not exclusive. Fish eat fish, bigger fish eat smaller fish, right? Birds of prey eat other prey.
Yes, but not the same species.
Yeah.
Can I make another point here, by the way? I didn't eat any of my babies. I told you I was a baby.
I'm glad you didn't, Chrissy, but we've got other questions. I know that Jude asked a question, and do you want me to read out the question that you've got for Don, or do you want to ask it yourself? No? Okay, Don, this is one from Jude Harris to you. Do you think it valid to question the effect that working in a slaughterhouse has on the people to whom we allocate these jobs in society that we prefer not to see? Tolstoy argued that there is a link between the slaughterhouse, let me just go down now, the slaughterhouse and battlefields. Perhaps we should extend our compassion to those who service the needs of the meat eater and suffer in the process.
Yes, I think there are a number of distasteful jobs that people do, and it probably is distasteful being in a slaughterhouse. It's also distasteful being in an operating theatre, and I think in many cases people become a little bit hardened to it or inured to it, and if they can't do that, then it's probably not the job for them.
Okay, so I mean, Jude, I'm going to give you my response, because I think the for me there is an invariable consequence of operating in the slaughterhouse is that most people will be psychologically affected by this, because they actually see the worthlessness of life, sentient life, in front of them. And I think that's going to psychologically affect them. And what is worse for them is that actually as part of society, they're actually seen as the bottom of the pile. So for example, in lots of cultures, people dealing with blood, etc., are on the lowest rung of society. Now, clearly in a Western society, it's not quite as drastic as that, but I think there's still something in the background. I wouldn't disagree with Don very strongly, though, that it's the same distastefulness in a slaughterhouse and in an operating theatre, because the intentionality is completely different. In a slaughterhouse, you take life deliberately for food or for what other purposes. You extinguish, annihilate life. Whereas in an operating theatre, you're doing everything you can to preserve life. And that's a completely different intentionality with a completely different psychological state of being than the slaughterhouse, would be my response to you, Jude. Colin, you've got another question.
Well, it's still probably not for those with a gentle disposition.
No,
but whether the experience of being in a slaughterhouse produces people who behave more badly in other circumstances towards human, that's something that we could research, but I haven't heard of anything of that nature.
But we're lucky to have a physician amongst us. Colin, you will have a view on this.
Well, I was going to defend people who work in slaughterhouses on the ground that I suspect one of their motivations may be that they feel that they are more compassionate and caring than other people who might do the same job, and that they feel that if this is a job that has to be done by somebody, it might be better that they did it rather than some people who rather enjoyed the slaughter. I suspect most of them don't have any pleasure in the slaughter, but have some feeling that maybe other people would do a worse job than they do. Yeah. I was going to raise an issue about this sort of urbanization of our population, with so many people living in cities and being very distracted in terms of not knowing about farming practices. Many children apparently having very little idea the connection between animals and food at all. So one is whether the veganism is coming from people in cities who don't really have any experience of country and farm life, and whether those people are actually trying to defend the rights of animals who may not suffer very much, but are actually imposing their views on other humans who may suffer as a result of their annoyance at being told what they should and shouldn't do by somebody who they perceive as having either little experience themselves and no right to interfere with their lives, where autonomy rules, and that you can do what you like with your life, but what gives you the right to tell other people what they should do with theirs, particularly if it's a long-standing custom and practice.
Is that directed towards Don or to me?
I'll go towards you for that, I think.
Quelle surprise. Right. So my view is very different. There's an old sort of adage about freedom, and it goes something like this. Go to school, get a job, get married, get a mortgage, join a club. Now repeat after me. I'm free. I'm free. So the point I would make back to you, Colin, is that actually the idea that we are exercising choices and we get annoyed by other people who tell us what to do, that is our existence for a vast majority of us throughout most of our life. And that if the annoyance is that somebody else is telling you how to lead your life, I think that's because they are not perceived to be in a position of authority. We're very good for people to tell us what we're doing. We're doing it right now. This is another lockdown, and most people are quite happily going to be complying with the lockdown. And people will, and I think you put your finger on something though. I think somebody telling you what to do is going to result, a man persuaded against his will is of the same opinion still. So if somebody tells you how to lead your life and you have your own background, your own personal life experience that tells you otherwise, you're not going to change your mind. You get annoyed about it because somebody's trying to impinge on your way of thinking. The only
Can I come in on this one?
Well, can I just
Andreas?
Can I just finish and make the point? I think absolutely, John, just give me 10 seconds. And that is, people should at least find out themselves, not be swayed by the opinions of one other person, but actually be curious enough to actually find out what is the case in particular situations. And I think
would you apply that to murder?
Pardon?
Would you apply that to murder?
I'd apply to self-defense.
Yeah, that's not murder.
But Don,
Yes.
sorry, I promised I would
I could just come in
Don.
before we go off Colin's point, but I think the essence of freedom is quite important. For example, I think that fox hunting is a completely stupid activity. It's pursued by people who are probably aspiring to be some sort of country upper class when they really aren't. And the whole thing is an absurd occupation. But despite all of that, I would absolutely allow people to do it because I don't believe in interfering with individual freedom. And the idea that cruelty to the fox is for animal welfare is ridiculous, because by killing a fox, you probably make a lot of rabbits very much happier and live longer lives. So there is this aspect of freedom and not interfering with people. But you might well argue that, are you being free to inflict suffering on all these animals? So it's a fine point.
Yeah. Okay.
Colin wants to come back, I think.
Yeah, now Colin wants to come back, but we'll go to iPad first.
Yes,
So-
also Duncan. Like I said, I want to respond to Colin and actually now respond to Don, because once upon a time, not long enough ago, it was quite conventional and acceptable to own slaves, and it would seem like a gross interference in slave owners' rights that these abolitionists come along and saying, well, I don't want to own slaves and I don't think you ought to own them either. And by the same argument, by which some people would say, well, you shouldn't be eating meat, I'm interfering in your life. I think the abolitionists did have a right to interfere in the lives of the slave owners.
I think you identify a very important point there, because what we've tended to do, especially as we've communicated more, and we've widened the circle to which we feel a moral duty. So it was certainly overdue that we widened it to all human beings. But how far do you widen it? We widen it to animals in the sense that we're concerned about their welfare. but you can't keep widening it to every living thing. We don't need to have bacteria with the right to vote, or we show not the slightest mercy to the coronavirus if we can do something about it. So not all life is of the same value, but the widening of our moral circle does indeed make sense, and absolutely to the extent of human life. And so slavery is quite inexcusable.
Okay,
somebody mentioned a fox, and I just wanted to tell you a story. We had a fox who lived in our meadow, and I had too many chickens because I was such a good mummy chick. You know, that even the ones that the hens would sit on, that I looked after and brought up. But I had too many of them. And this poor fox was very hungry. So every night I would leave the chicken run open so he could come and have a chicken until he'd had more than I had. I didn't want him to have any more, so I shut the door. And he turned up in the daytime and picked up one of my chickens. And I shouted at him, so no, you can't have that. And he took it as far as the wood and put it down and let it run back to me. But the point is, I'm talking about, I was looking after the fox.
Yeah.
I knew he needed food too.
Yeah.
You know, it's nature. I think I understand nature better than all you city dwellers because I've lived with that.
Good. Chrissy, you provided a balance to nature. Very good.
Yeah.
Colin, over to you again, and then we need to come to Anna in the chat room as well. So, Colin, you want to come back on something or not?
Yeah. Well, so my moral philosophy is very much about autonomy, and to be a defender of slavery would be absolutely outside any philosophy that I have. So don't put that one on me. So the other thing I was saying is how do we deal with sort of animal husbandry, butchery in the UK? So we seem to have taken our urbanisation and people's detachment from that. And so one thing we do is we have laws about welfare standards, which I think are slightly higher in the UK, possibly lower than a lot of people would like. And we probably should spend more of our incomes on food if we're going to continue to eat meat, so that the welfare things are even better. But it's quite difficult for one country to do that alone with our sort of trading system. And so one is to have legislation for a minimum standard, and the other is to offer information so that people who have got the income can choose to buy products from even higher welfare states, which is what we also have at the moment. So you can choose to find out more and to buy products that come from an even better welfare thing. And I think that's a reasonable balance. Yeah. And I think sort of radical veganism imposed on people who strike a reasonable balance is probably wrong. But I do approve of even higher standards than we have in the UK at the moment.
Yeah. So I think you're right. I mean, the idea of vegan imposition is one thing, but I think actually having a reasonable and seasoned debate around all of this from both sides of the landscape, I think is eminently sensible, because it's only through discussions and debates like this do we actually move forward as part of society. And that includes what Duncan talked about in terms of slavery. Obviously, at some point, people decided that actually slavery was not the acceptable or best way forward in terms of how we treat each other. So I'll leave it at that. I've got Anna in the chat room, and I think I'm going to direct this at Don, and then we've got two more questions, and I think we need to wrap up. We're already past the watershed here. Haven't we gone too far down the path to altering the natural world? For example, no large carnivores survive in most Western countries. To even think of allowing farm animals to revert to their natural state? And in any case, how many would survive? Don.
Well, yes, I agree that we certainly have altered the natural world, and we look like continuing to do it more, although hopefully with the ideas of climate change and so on, we are going to try to mitigate that. But yes, we've totally changed the natural world. The mammoth doesn't survive anymore in Europe. It's been one process of change as humanity has expanded and exerted its power over the whole planet.
Okay. And the final question is from C. Dyer, to me, I think. Do people on low income have the same chances to choose ethical meats or non-meat products? To which I would say non-organic meat is definitely more expensive than mechanized food industry produced meat. But I would say that you can live a perfectly acceptable and nourished vegan existence on very reasonable vegetables, minerals, and fruit. But I get the point. You know, some people can't afford the organic way of life, but you don't need to be organic to actually achieve a balanced nutritional lifestyle. That's it. Don, before we go, so thank you very much for everybody for contributing. I hope you all enjoyed it. I thought it was a very good discussion. And obviously, it's been forever eternalized on the YouTube channel in a month's time. So we can refer back to all of these comments for time immemorial. And when we dial back into our philosophy about veganism in 50 years' time, society may have moved on. You never know. But before we go, Don, have you got anything to mention about the forthcoming events?
Well, just to thank everybody for coming. We will be, of course, in action on the first Tuesday of next month as well. And I'll be sending you out a newsletter with the future program in a few days' time.
Okay, and just to whet your appetite then, we've got next month, on the 2nd of February, we've got Stephen Mulholl, Professor of Philosophy at Oxford University. He's written countless books on philosophy and has also appeared several times on In Our Time with Melvyn Bragg, so I would recommend that. That's a premier event, so it's going to be slightly more expensive. It's like the old box office events, so it's £4 for members and £7 for non-members. But he's going to be talking about phenomenology, a different way of the way we look at the world. And I think that's something quite interesting, which I would encourage you all to come to. That's on the 2nd of February. And then on I think it's the 2nd of March, maybe the 3rd of March, the March one anyway, is the well-known philosopher Julian Badgini, who is also the editor of the Philosophy magazine and the author of How the World Thinks. And he's going to give a talk on pragmatism and culture, East and West. Again, that's a premier event, £4 for members and £7 for visitors. But these are two extremely well-known philosophers and individuals, and I hope you will enjoy both phenomenology and pragmatism in culture in March. So without further ado, I wish you a safe, healthy, and increasingly importantly, sane January until we meet again in February. Good night. All the very best to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Good night.
This is